Have you ever wondered how a microscopic parasite fooled the greatest doctors in history? This video breaks down the shocking journey from ancient China to 19th century Paris, and why truth was always one step away. If you trust modern medicine without question, this story will challenge that comfort. Watch until the end to discover the moment humanity finally accepted what was hiding in plain sight. Truth retreats, hiding once more. Inside her ancient cave, mountains of twisted arguments are piled above her head. Philosophy, once leaning on heaven itself, now shrinks back to second causes, the south sides and fades away. Medicine begs metaphysics for protection. Metaphysics cries out to the senses for help. Watch mystery flee towards mathematics. In vain. They stare. They grow dizzy. They lose their minds. And they fall. Alexander Pope, the Dunciad. Elements and phlogiston. For centuries, the belief that earth, air, fire, and water formed the basic elements of nature remained firmly rooted in human thought. Even in the 18th century, chemists still held to this ancient doctrine. The origin of the idea is commonly traced to Empedocles, and it was later systematized by Aristotle. Yet not all thinkers were satisfied with 4 elements alone. Some speculative philosophers argued that these elements themselves sprang from a single original principle. To some, this first substance was water; to others, earth, fire, or air. Paracelsus, never one to resist imaginative theories, accepted this idea, but expanded it with a bold and fantastic addition. He declared that all things were composed of sulfur, salt, and mercury. By these terms, however, he did not mean the physical substances known to merchants, but refined inner essences that governed the nature of matter. These 3 essentials came to represent deeper forces. Salt symbolized the body, matter, and patience. Sulfur stood for the soul, form, and active nature. Mercury embodied spirit, movement, and intelligence. Together, they were believed to bridge the material and the spiritual worlds. Combinations in nature. Examples of these principles were thought to appear everywhere in nature. When green wood is burned, the first thing released is moisture, which was identified as mercury. Next comes an oily, easily inflammable substance, recognized as sulfur. Finally, a dry and earthy residue remains, known as salt. Milk was also divided in this way. Its buttery portion was considered sulfurous, the whey mercurial, and the cheese saline. Eggs were similarly analyzed, the white as mercury, the yolk as sulfur, and the shell as salt. Even minerals such as antimony were explained through these categories, each component revealing its hidden principle when exposed to fire or force. George Ernest Stahl and phlogiston. Fire as the hidden agent. And George Ernest Stahl, born in the late 17th century, became the chief architect of the phlogiston theory, which dominated chemical thought until it was finally overturned near the end of the 18th century. His central idea revolved around fire, from which he derived the elusive substance known as phlogiston. Phlogiston was imagined as something that permeated the air itself, invisible and inactive until it encountered material bodies. Whether it possessed weight was uncertain. When united with matter, it entered a passive state, rendering the substance phlogisticated. Only under special conditions could it be stirred into action again. The paradox of weight. When theory began to break, The true absurdities of the phlogiston theory emerged when metals were heated and reduced to calx instead of becoming lighter after losing phlogiston. The residue was heavier than the original metal. At first, it was suggested that phlogiston possessed not only no weight, but an actual quality of lightness. This explanation strained credibility. Another proposal claimed that escaping phlogiston attacked the vessel itself and carried part of it into the metal. This, too, failed under experiment. Finally, a more imaginative solution appeared. Phlogiston, it was argued, had weight, but while absorbed into a substance, it remained in constant motion, like a bird flying inside a cage. Just as the bird adds no weight while in flight, phlogiston contributed nothing until it became fixed and lifeless during calcination. Only then, it was said, did the metal grow heavier. Humours and degrees. The body as a living balance. The doctrine of the humours, often called humoral pathology, is traditionally traced back to Hippocrates. It is presented in the treatise On the Nature of Man, a work Galen believed to be genuinely authored by the physician of Kos, though later scholars have suggested it may have been written by his followers. Regardless of authorship, the text is widely accepted as representing Hippocratic thought. Plato refined the idea, and Galen eventually fixed it into a rigid and authoritative system. According to this doctrine, the human body was not composed directly of earth, air, fire, and water, but of their essential qualities. From these arose the four bodily humours: blood, phlegm, bile, and black bile. Alongside them operated three kinds of spirits: natural, vital, and animal, which animated the humours and set them in motion throughout the body. Blood was believed to nourish every part of the body and to generate animal heat. Bile kept the bodily passages open and aided digestion. Phlegm preserved flexibility in nerves, muscles, cartilage, the tongue, and other organs, allowing smooth movement. Black bile, which Hippocrates called melancholy, served as a binding force between the other humours and sustained their balance. The relative proportions of these humours were thought to determine temperament. This belief still echoes in modern language. Even today, we speak of sanguine, bilious, phlegmatic, or melancholic dispositions, terms inherited directly from this ancient medical imagination. Each humour possessed its own character. Blood was naturally hot and moist. Phlegm was cold and moist. Bile was hot and dry. Black bile was cold and dry. Disease arose when these humours were altered or displaced. Such conditions were known as distempers. An excess of any humour could bring illness. Too much blood produced drowsiness, shortness of breath, and fatty degeneration. An excess of bile corrupted the blood, causing jaundice, foul breath, and bitterness of taste. A surplus of black bile was believed to result in hemorrhoids, leprosy, or even cancer. Excess phlegm gave rise to colds, catarrhs, and rheumatic ailments. It must not be imagined that Galen or other authorities believed the humours alone caused disease. Ancient pathology was extraordinarily complex. The doctrine of the humours is mentioned here chiefly to explain how medicines were thought to act within this system. Medicines, like humours, were classified by their qualities: hot, cold, moist, or dry. Galen divided these qualities into 4 degrees. A drug could be hot or cold in the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, or 4th degree. The physician's task was therefore to determine which humour dominated the patient, and to what degree, before selecting a remedy capable of restoring balance. Herbal manuals served as guides. Horehound, for example, was said to be hot in the 2nd degree and dry in the 3rd. Pansies were cold and moist in both herb and flower. Mustard, which raised blisters on the skin, was hot in the 4th degree. Medicines that provoked heavy sweating and broke down stubborn humors were hot in the 3rd degree. Opium was classified as cold in the 4th degree. For this reason, it was considered dangerous unless used to ease extreme pain. In ordinary treatment, physicians were advised to temper its coldness by combining it with substances of milder heat or cold. An especially revealing illustration of the reverence inspired by this doctrine comes from the medieval Islamic world. A 9th-century scholar, Jacob ibn Ishaq al-Kindi, renowned for his work in mathematics, philosophy, astrology and medicine, extended Galen's theory to compound medicines. He even explained their effects using the principles of musical harmony. According to his system, medicinal degrees progressed not arithmetically, but geometrically. Thus, the 4th degree was 16 times stronger than the 1st. Though expressed through mathematical formulas, the idea was simple in intent. Balance could be calculated in precise numerical harmony. Using carefully weighed ingredients, physicians calculated the hot, cold, moist, and dry qualities of each component. A compound medicine could thus be declared perfectly balanced in heat and cold, yet dry in the 1st or 2nd degree, depending on the final proportions. When one considers that physicians also had to judge whether a remedy suited one organ but not another, it becomes clear that prescribing medicine under these ancient dogmas was a demanding and exacting art. The Rosicrucians. Mysticism, healing, and a manufactured legend. So far as history can tell, the Rosicrucian mystics of the Middle Ages contributed nothing directly to the advancement of pharmacy. They are remembered here not for scientific discovery, but because they claimed the power to heal disease, and because the legends surrounding them arose at nearly the same moment as another curious creation of the age, the figure of Basil Valentine. Between the years 1614 and 1616, 3 remarkable works appeared, each claiming to reveal the secret history of the Brotherhood of the Rosy Cross. The first was known as The Fame of the Fraternity. The second bore the title The Confession of the Fraternity. The third, and by far the most influential, was called The Chemical Marriage of Christian Rosenkreutz. These writings were composed in a deliberately obscure and mystical language. Some readers understood them as alchemical allegories, others as religious parables. Yet many learned men accepted them as literal records of historical fact. According to these accounts, Christian Rosenkreutz was a German born in the late 14th century. In his youth, he was said to have travelled through the East, learning wisdom from Arabian sages and other masters of hidden knowledge. From them, he acquired secrets of religion, alchemy, and necromancy. Upon his return to Germany, Rosenkreutz gathered around him 7 companions. Together, they formed a secret fraternity, sworn to remain hidden from the world for a full century. The brethren communicated only with one another, sharing discoveries and preserving ancient knowledge entrusted to them alone. They pledged themselves to treat the sick poor without payment. They wore no special garments by which they could be recognized, though they marked their writings with the letters C and R. They were said to possess the secret of making gold, yet they cared little for wealth and sought neither power nor riches. The brethren were required to meet once each year. Each member chose his own successor, yet no monuments were to mark their graves. Christian Rosenkreutz himself was said to have lived to the age of 106. Long after his death, his skeleton was allegedly discovered concealed within a building, a wall having been constructed around his resting place. Since their chief mission was the healing of the sick poor, it was assumed that the Rosicrucians must have possessed deep medical knowledge. Yet the books reveal nothing of practical value. Their wisdom was not gained through study or experiment, but through direct divine illumination. Their doctrines, such as they were, followed the teachings of Paracelsus. Despite their mystical character, the fraternity was firmly Protestant in spirit. The most remarkable aspect of the Rosicrucian story is not the mystery itself, but the seriousness with which it was believed. The documents announcing the fraternity bear every mark of fiction, yet they were widely accepted as truth. Almost immediately after their publication, German universities were consumed by fierce debates over the authenticity of the revelations. Scholars argued passionately for and against the existence of the Brotherhood, and the controversy endured for nearly 2 centuries. Extensive research into the origin of the original treatises has since been conducted. The conclusion most often reached is that they were written by a German theologian from Württemberg, Johann Valentin Andreas, born in the late 16th century. It is reported that before his death he openly confessed that the entire history of the Rosicrucians had been composed as a deliberate work of fiction. The doctrine of signatures. The doctrine of signatures, whatever its faults, was at least intelligible. It harmonized easily with the pious language so common among medieval teachers of medicine. The belief was simple and deeply devotional. The Creator, in providing herbs for the use of humankind, had marked many of them with visible signs indicating their special healing powers. Roots that resembled the human body were believed to reveal their purpose. The ginseng root, long used by the Chinese as a remedy for impotence, and the mandrake, employed by Hebrews and Greeks in the treatment of sterility, were cited as ancient examples. Their resemblance to the male form appeared to confirm the doctrine's antiquity. Yet such isolated cases do little to prove the existence of a systematic belief. Hippocrates himself observed that diseases might sometimes be cured by remedies that resembled them, but he was not the founder of homeopathy. It seems more likely that belief in these visible indications grew gradually within monasteries, perhaps born from curious coincidences rather than theory. The doctrine gained wide acceptance in the 16th century, largely because of the authority and confidence with which Paracelsus embraced it. Mystical medical writers such as Oswald Crolius and Giovanni Battista Porta taught it enthusiastically. Still, its influence faded quickly and did not extend much beyond the 17th century. Dr. Paris later condemned the doctrine of signatures as the most absurd hypothesis ever to disgrace medicine. Yet apart from encouraging experiments with a handful of useless herbs, it is difficult to justify such harsh judgment. At its heart, the doctrine was less a scientific system than a poetic vision of nature. In many cases, signatures were observed only after a remedy's effects were already known. The poppy, for example, was assigned to disorders of the brain because its capsule resembles a human head. Yet its reputation as a soothing agent for the mind was far older than this symbolic interpretation. To understand the reasoning behind the doctrine, it is enough to examine a few examples preserved in early herbals. Saxifrages were believed to break rocks, therefore their use in dissolving bladder stones seemed obvious. Roses were prescribed for disorders of the blood, rhubarb and saffron for bile-related ailments, and turmeric for jaundice, all because of their colour. Trefoil was said to protect the heart, not only because its leaf is triangular, but because each leaf was believed to contain a perfect image of the human heart. Birthwort earned its name from the shape of its flower, which was thought to resemble the organs of childbirth. Bladderwort owed its reputation to its inflated form. Bloodroot, with its red root, was destined to cure bloody fluxes. Kernelwort, bearing tubers on its roots, was prescribed for swollen glands of the neck. Canterbury bells, with their long throats, were assigned to sore throats. Thistles, because they prick, were thought to cure stabbing pains in the side. Even the scorpion grass, once the name of the forget-me-not, was believed to cure scorpion stings, its coiled spike resembling the creature's tail. Oswald Crollius, who styled himself a Hermetic physician and philosopher, devoted an entire treatise to the doctrine. In a long and devout preface, he declared the knowledge of signatures to be the most valuable branch of botany. Yet, he lamented, fewer than one physician in 10 had mastered it sufficiently to satisfy patients. Crollius presented his conclusions with complete confidence, as though they had been mathematically proven. He never suggested that a signature might admit more than one interpretation. From their shells, one could prepare remedies for wounds of the skull. The thin skin around the kernel cured inflammation of the brain's membranes. Walnuts, he declared, bore the complete signature of the human head. The kernel itself strengthened and nourished the brain. The down on quince fruit showed that it would prevent hair loss. Moss growing on trees would do the same. Plants were endlessly interpreted. Asarum bore the signature of the ears and thus improved hearing and memory. Euphrasia and chamomile cured the eyes. Henbane seeds, resembling the jaw, relieved toothache. Lemons represented the heart, ginger the stomach, cassia the bowels, aristolochia the womb, and plantain the nerves and veins. Sometimes the signature mirrored the disease itself. Lily of the valley, with its drooping flowers, was prescribed for apoplexy. Red substances were favored for bleeding. Wolves' livers cured liver disease. Fox lungs healed the lungs. Even dried worms mixed with goat's milk were used to expel intestinal worms. Vipers were prized for their supposed power of renewing youth. Salt derived from human urine was recommended against calculi and tartar. Color itself was often treated as a signature. Medical texts strongly advised red hangings for patients suffering from smallpox. John of Gaddesden, physician to an English king, proudly recorded that when he treated a royal child for smallpox, he surrounded the bed entirely with red fabrics. The result, he claimed, was a perfect recovery without a single scar. Thus, under the doctrine of signatures, medicine became a language of signs. Nature was read as a book written by the divine hand, its letters formed by shapes, colors, and resemblances. Science had not yet learned to separate poetry from proof. Metals and precious stones. In earlier examples, parts of animals were believed to carry healing powers. This belief was not accidental, it flowed naturally from the same doctrine. Metals, too, were thought to possess medicinal virtues, not only because of their physical qualities, but because of their symbolic names and the gods and planets with which they had long been associated. The sun governed the heart, and gold was the metal of the sun. Therefore, gold was considered a powerful cordial, strengthening life itself. In the same manner, the moon was linked to silver, and silver to the head. Iron was believed to restore strength, for it belonged to Mars, the planet of force and vigor. William Culpeper warned physicians to be cautious in these correspondences. Take care, he advised, that you do not apply medicines intended for one part of the body to another, for if the brain is overheated and you give remedies that cool the heart or liver, you may cause great disorder. In this system, medicine was not merely about substances, but about harmony between organs, elements, and invisible influences. Yet the choice of remedies was not always so straightforward. At times, treatment required opposition rather than sympathy. Saturn, ruling the bones, was believed to cause toothache. But if Jupiter stood in the ascendant at that moment, the correct remedy was one governed by Jupiter, the opposing planet. Modern astronomy has placed the heavens at such a distance that we no longer think of them as intimate companions of human life. In Culpeper's words, "It will seem strange only to madmen and fools that the stars should influence the body of man, For man, being a miniature of creation, must contain a celestial world within himself. If there is unity in the divine, there must also be unity in all his works, not a creation hanging together like a rope of sand. Sympathetic remedies. Among the many strange theories that have appeared throughout the history of medicine, there are few whose acceptance is more difficult to explain than the belief in what were called sympathetic remedies. Their success seems to have rested not upon evidence, but rather upon the extraordinary confidence placed in ideas that were, in truth, without any rational foundation. Yet these beliefs were not confined to the ignorant. They were adopted, defended, and practiced by men who were otherwise capable of clear and intelligent reasoning. The literature on sympathetic medicine is vast, and a full account would fill an entire chapter. For our purpose, however, a selection of the most striking examples will be enough to demonstrate that these methods were regarded with complete seriousness by physicians, philosophers, and scholars of high standing. The origin of the idea can be traced to very early periods of human thought. Dr. James George Frazer, whose work on primitive belief systems remains authoritative, connects the biblical prohibition, "You shall not boil a kid in its mother's milk," with an ancient conviction that such an act would cause suffering to the animal from which the milk had been taken. The belief rested on the assumption that actions performed upon a substance could transmit their effects to the living being associated with it. If pain could be conveyed in this manner, then it followed naturally, at least within that framework of thought, that healing might also be transferred. Pliny, as quoted by Cornelius Agrippa, provides an illustration that was long accepted as a practical example of sympathetic action. He writes that if a man regretted having struck another, whether the injured person was near or far away, and immediately spat into the palm of the hand with which the blow had been given, the pain of the wounded person would instantly cease. Such statements were not recorded as curiosities, but as observations believed to rest upon experience. Paracelsus carried the theory much further, investing it with the elaborate confidence that characterized many of his more speculative doctrines. His celebrated Unguentum Sympatheticum was prepared according to a formula that left nothing to chance. Fats of boar and bear were slowly boiled and purified. To these were added powdered burnt worms, dried boar's brain, red sandalwood, mummy substance, bloodstone, and most significantly, moss taken from the skull of a man who had died a violent death, preferably by hanging and certainly unburied. Even the time of collection mattered. It was to be gathered at the rising of the moon, under the influence of Venus if possible, and never under Mars or Saturn. The ointment itself was to be prepared in the autumn and preserved carefully in a sealed glass vessel. According to Paracelsus, the application of this ointment did not involve treating the wound directly. Instead, it was the weapon that had caused the injury which was to be anointed. Distance was irrelevant. The remedy would act no matter how far the wounded person might be. Certain limitations were admitted. Severed arteries or injuries to vital organs lay beyond its power. But in ordinary wounds, the method was said to be effective. The wound itself was to be bandaged carefully, the dressings moistened with the patient's urine, while the weapon, once treated, was wrapped in clean linen and protected from dust and draughts. Neglect of these precautions, it was claimed, would result in renewed pain for the patient. Paracelsus explained the action of the remedy as a magnetic process. A subtle current passed through the air from the anointed weapon to the wound, acting upon the natural healing balsam believed to exist in every living body. This invisible transmission was compared to the way in which the heat of the sun travels through the air to reach the earth. The same principle appeared in other treatments attributed to Paracelsus. Leaves applied to sores and ulcers were to be buried afterward, so that they might draw the disease away into the ground. One of his followers explained that the buried leaves attracted evil spirits as a magnet attracts iron, thus removing the source of illness from the patient. Another invention was the so-called sympathetic egg. An empty egg was filled with warm blood from a healthy person, sealed, and placed beneath a brooding hen, so that its vitality would not be impaired. Afterward, it was baked and applied to the diseased part before being buried, carrying the illness with it through a stronger natural affinity. Robert Fludd, the Rosicrucian physician, was among the most fervent defenders of the weapon salvive. Replying to critics, he argued that an ointment composed of substances drawn from the human body must possess spiritual power, since the soul itself operated through the blood. A spiritual line, he maintained, extended through the air between the wounded person and the ointment, much like a sunbeam stretching from the sun. Without this invisible line, the healing power would dissipate uselessly. The belief was shared by other leading thinkers of the 17th century, including Van Helmont, Descartes, and Baptista Porta. Van Helmont's most famous example concerned a man who lost his nose in a duel and later had it reconstructed using flesh taken from a servant's arm. For over a year, the nose functioned perfectly until it suddenly grew cold and decayed. The explanation was simple. The servant had died. Van Helmont insisted that eyewitnesses to this event still lived in Brussels. Among all the advocates of sympathetic medicine, Sir Kenelm Digby became the most celebrated. A courtier, adventurer, philosopher, and prodigy of conversation, Digby lectured widely on the virtues of the powder of sympathy. When a friend lay near death from a sword wound, Digby dissolved his powder in water and soaked the blood-stained bandage. Soon afterward, the patient reported relief from pain, the fever subsided, and the wound healed, without any medicine being applied to the body itself. Digby attributed his knowledge to a Carmelite monk he had met in Florence. Later descriptions of the powder reveal it to have been prepared from crystallized vitriol, slowly dried in sunlight. Digby's explanation followed the familiar pattern. Solar rays extracted spiritual atoms from the blood and the mineral, while the wounded body exhaled inflamed particles, creating a current through which healing could occur. Stories multiplied, some solemnly reported, others bordering on the absurd. A carpenter's wound flared painfully when the axe that had been treated with ointment fell from its nail. Writers and poets seized upon the idea, sometimes mocking it, sometimes repeating it as accepted truth. References appear in Hudibras, in Dryden's Tempest, and in the verses of Sir Walter Scott. By the end of the 17th century, skepticism began to gain ground. Lemery openly questioned the powder's effects, and in the following century, Baume declared its claims to be entirely illusory. Thus closed one of the most remarkable episodes in medical delusion, a chapter that reveals not merely human credulity, but the deep and enduring desire to believe that healing might transcend distance, matter, and reason itself. Animal magnetism. The earliest reference to the use of the magnet as a remedy for disease appears in the writings of Aetius, a physician of the early 6th century. He records that merely holding a magnet in the hand was believed to bring relief to sufferers of gout. Aetius himself does not claim to have tested this method, but his mention shows that the idea was already circulating as accepted knowledge. By the 15th and 16th centuries, belief in the medicinal powers of magnets had grown considerably. Medical writers of the period strongly recommended magnets for toothache, headache, convulsions, and disorders of the nerves. Toward the end of the 17th century, magnetic toothpicks and earpicks were even manufactured and sold. These curious instruments were credited not only with relieving pain, but also with preventing diseases of the teeth and ears altogether. It was Paracelsus who gave animal magnetism its theoretical foundation. The strange power of the lodestone, capable of attracting iron and transferring its force, was, in his view, an influence derived directly from the stars. This invisible force, which he named magnal, was not confined to minerals alone, but was believed to exist in all living beings. By this principle, Paracelsus explained why certain plants turn toward the sun, and upon the same idea he constructed his theories of talismans and sympathetic remedies. He applied magnets in the treatment of epilepsy and prepared a substance he called magisterium magnetis, convinced that magnetism could be concentrated and directed for healing purposes. Johann Rudolf Glauber expanded these ideas with characteristic boldness. He claimed to possess a secret magnet capable of drawing out only the essence or tincture of metals, leaving their coarse substance behind. Using this method, he prepared tinctures of iron and copper, poetically describing the process as robbing the dragon of the golden fleece which it guards. Interpreted more plainly, this referred to dissolving metals in strong acid. Glauber believed the resulting tincture to be a powerful restorative, comparable to the myth in which Jason restored his aged father to youth. He even reported that black, curly hair began to grow upon his bald head after he tested it on himself. Unfortunately, the supply ran out before the experiment could be completed, and though he wished to prepare more, he never did so in time. Van Helmont, Robert Flood, and other physicians of mystical temperament became ardent supporters of animal magnetism. Magnets were ground into powder and administered in salves, plasters, pills, and potions. Yet in 1660, Dr. William Gilbert of Colchester observed that once powdered, the lodestone lost its magnetic properties entirely. It gradually became clear that powdered magnet could produce no effects different from those of any other iron-containing substance. Despite this realization, belief in the healing power of magnets applied to the body did not disappear. The theory was taken up enthusiastically by later practitioners, most notably in the late 18th century by Franz Anton Mesmer. In Paris, Mesmer's demonstrations provoked extraordinary excitement. Society divided itself into supporters and opponents, while the court, the government, and even the Academy of Sciences were drawn into the controversy. Benjamin Franklin remarked that at one point Mesmer was earning more in fees than all the regular physicians of Paris combined. Yet Mesmer's explanations differed little in substance from the ideas first imagined by Paracelsus. The movement found less fertile ground in England, but around the same period, an American named Perkins introduced his metallic tractors, creating a brief national frenzy. These instruments were claimed to draw disease from the body by magnetic force. The illusion was finally exposed by Dr. Haygarth of Bath, who treated patients with wooden replicas painted to resemble the tractors. The results were identical. Relief was felt, cures were reported, and the conclusion was unavoidable. Whatever benefit occurred arose not from magnetism, but from belief itself. The treatment of itch. The history of the treatment of itch offers one of the clearest examples of how medical authority can be accepted blindly for centuries, even when the true explanation lies almost within reach. For this reason alone, the story deserves to be told. Some historical accounts state that the disease was known in China thousands of years ago. The name given to it, Chong Qi, meaning pustules formed by a worm, suggests that at least at the time this term was adopted, the Chinese had some awareness of the nature of the disorder. Certain writers have suggested that some of the forms of uncleanness described in the book of Leviticus may refer to itch. It is quite possible that in earlier times the disease assumed a much more severe form than it does today, due to neglect or misguided treatment. The Greek term sora and its Latin equivalent scabies almost certainly included itch, though they probably referred to a variety of skin diseases that are now more precisely distinguished. Hippocrates mentions sora and appears to have treated it solely with internal remedies such as diluents and purgatives. Aristotle went further, noting not only the disease itself, but also the insects he believed to exist within the blisters. Celsus recommended ointments made from substances such as verdigris, myrrh, nitre, white lead, and sulfur, while Galen warned that external applications might drive the disease inward. By the time of Cicero, Horace, and Juvenal, the word scabies had even acquired a metaphorical meaning used to describe something morally or socially corrupt. The Arab physicians were far more explicit. Rhazes, Heliobas, and Avicenna gave detailed descriptions of the disease and recognized its contagious nature. Avicenna, however, treated it as a disorder of the humors, prescribing bleeding and purgatives, particularly one called hammock, while also advising strengthening the constitution through diet and astringent medicines. A remarkable step forward was taken in the 12th century by Avenzoar of Seville. He described a common skin disease known as soab, which he attributed to a minute insect living beneath the skin, so small as to be scarcely visible, escaping only when the skin was punctured. At this point, one might expect that a correct understanding of itch was close at hand. Indeed, later writers clearly recognized the presence of the parasite. Ambroise Paré, writing in the 16th century, described the cirrons as tiny creatures crawling beneath the skin, gnawing slowly and causing intense itching. He even advised removing them with needles. Yet despite such observations, itch continued to be treated as a disorder of the humors requiring internal remedies. This view was firmly maintained in Mercuriali's influential work, De Morbis Cutanis, published in Venice in 1601, where the disease was attributed to corrupted humors and considered contagious through fluids deposited on the skin. Variations of this explanation remained orthodox well into the 17th century. Even Van Helmont, though cured of itch himself, never progressed beyond the idea of a specific ferment as its cause. The first genuinely scientific advance came from Thomas Muffet of London. In his 1634 treatise Insectorum Sive, Minimorum Animalium Theatrum, he demonstrated that the animalculae were constantly associated with itch and, crucially, that they were found not in the blisters themselves, but in the tunnels beneath the skin. This insight should have resolved the matter, but it was largely ignored. The invention of the microscope soon followed. In 1657, the German naturalist Hauptmann published a crude magnified drawing of the insect, later improved upon by Ettmüller. Still, the medical establishment remained unconvinced. In 1687, a pharmacist of Leghorn named Sistoni persuaded Dr. Bonomo to join him in a series of experiments. Both men had observed women extracting the insects from their children's skin with needles. Their resulting treatise argued clearly that itch was parasitic in origin and that internal remedies were useless. They recommended sulfur or mercury ointments as essential treatment. Even then, authority prevailed over evidence. While Linnaeus supported their conclusions, he incorrectly identified the itch parasite as the cheese mite. Leading physicians of the 18th century, including Hoffmann and Boerhaave, continued to advocate general treatments. Although parasiticidal substances were sometimes included among their prescriptions, and thus cures did occur, the success was credited to the wrong causes. Toward the end of the century, Hahnemann advanced the theory of a soric miasm, claiming it lay behind many chronic diseases. Confusion persisted. Some believed there were two forms of itch, one parasitic and one not. Others claimed the insect was produced by the disease itself. The debate continued until 1834, when François Renucci, assistant to Dalibert at the Hôpital Saint-Louis in Paris, undertook to extract the parasite in every genuine case. He had seen this done in his youth in Corsica, just as Bonomo and Sistoni had observed it in Italy. Even then, acceptance was slow. It was not until the middle of the 19th century that the parasitic nature of itch was universally acknowledged. If you enjoy deep stories like this, where history, medicine, and forgotten truths collide, please support the channel by liking, subscribing, and sharing. It truly helps these stories reach more minds.